Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to today's session of our fall series, Dangerous Ideas, Censorship Through a Jewish Lens, and special welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time today. We're so pleased to have our JTS fellow, Dr. Edna Friedberg, who I know is a real favorite in our Monday series. She is a JTS alum and senior curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in BC. And you'll hear more about her in a few minutes. I also want to extend our gratitude to our sponsors for today, Phyllis Levy, who has sponsored in loving memory of Rose and Edward Israel Kessler and Corey Fyland. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for your generosity. For sponsoring at the Chacham level. We hope that your sponsorship will inspire others to do the same. You're sponsored by Felix and by this amazing opportunity to learn with JTS scholars. We would love for you to consider partnering with us by sponsoring a session. We have 3 sponsorship levels, Chacham, Tzaddik, and Navi for $540, $1,000, and $1,800. There has been a link posted in the chat where you can learn more. And I'd like to turn it over to Connie Schwartz-Herman.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format for today's session, as we usually do, Dr. Friedberg will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can chat your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman, and she'll select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Friedberg. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat either with myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received this morning with the Zoom link. We'll be screen sharing them and sharing a link shortly in the chat as well. Pleased to introduce Dr. Edna Friedberg, JTS Fellow and Senior Curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Friedberg received her PhD in Modern Jewish Studies from JTS, where she wrote a dissertation on the origins of American Jewish services for the elderly. Dr. Friedberg speaks to audiences across the country, and her essays connecting Holocaust history with social, cultural, and political trends today are published regularly. You can read more about Dr. Friedberg in the bio with the sources. And we're so pleased to have her teaching us today. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Friedberg.
Thank you, Tani. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Phyllis, for your sponsorship. And thank you, all of you, for joining. As Tani said, I got my PhD at JTS. It's always like coming home when I do one of these sessions, and I'm very pleased to be part of this series. I hope that most of you or many of you have the source packet with you. There's a lot more material in there than I'll be able to cover in today's session, and I hope you will find it interesting. This is a kind of troubling and disturbing topic and also fascinating, and I enjoyed preparing for it today. I hope you will find it thought-provoking as well. So Tani, if we could start showing the slides, please. I want to begin with a little bit of context for banning of books, for censoring of books, which are not the same thing. Sometimes people are comfortable viewing something or reading something, but don't want it in its entirety. So if we can get started with the slides, I will give you a little bit of context.
Sorry, just give me one second.
Go up to where it says slide in the middle of the menu, and then you should be able to play slideshow. Or view, sorry, go to view. Yep, slideshow. Exactly. Okay, great. So to give all of us a sense of just how long attempts to control information have been around, we have early evidence as early as the 3rd century BCE here from this piece of art from China in the year 213. It's an actual illustration of a book burning. Book burnings and book censorship have been with us since as long as people began putting ink or dyes to paper. For example, as we see here in China, Emperor Qin Shi Huang burned books of philosophy and history, when he assumed power as a way of consolidating his control over society, elevating his status. But he also, according to reports, did not want to be compared to more successful or more virtuous rulers who had come before him. And by destroying the writings of the past, Emperor Qin Shi Huang thought that history could begin anew with him. So that's very old historically. Going to more present day and our country in particular, according to the American Library Association, between the beginning of this year until the end of October 2022, there were 781 reported attempts, and surely many more than that, attempts to ban or restrict library resources in the United States. So I wanted to offer this context also to remind us that a lot of what we're talking about, it is not always specific to the Holocaust content. Sometimes it is part of larger trends, larger anxieties about what people, especially young people and students, have access to and what they read. So we have that as a context. But when we think about Holocaust books in particular, and book bans or book censorship, of course, we immediately are jerked back to the Nazi era. And if we could go to the next slide. Scenes like this from spring 1933, in this case, members of the SA, the Nazi security force, and university students looking at books that have been deemed un-German and will not only be banned, but be physically destroyed, to be burned in bonfires as part of a coordinated effort. Next slide, please. All over Germany. And we see here it was really quite a spectacle. A reminder to ourselves also that these book burnings that took place in 1933 were done primarily on university campuses. And I want us to keep that in mind because this was a very deliberate strategy by the Nazi regime to make places that to our minds are places of free academic inquiry, of intellectual exploration, and that in this case, they were part of what the Nazis euphemistically called consolidation of culture, of determining what could be part of German society and what was on the outside. It was very often, and I won't spend a lot of time today talking about the book burnings, we could have a whole session just on that, Jewish authors whose works were burned, artists as well, like Marc Chagall, pieces of music that were deemed degenerate in Nazi terminology, which included jazz music. But I'll give us just one example, if we can go to the next slide. One of the authors whose books were burned was this man who wrote under the pen name Felix Salten. His given name was Zygmunt Salzmann, and he was an Austrian Jewish author, a journalist, part of a movement known as Young Vienna. That might be familiar to some of you. But what may be surprising is the book of Salten's that was banned. We can go to the next slide and see a cover. In 1922, Felix Salten published this book called Bambi, eine Lebensgeschichte aus dem Wald, or Bambi, a life in the woods. Now, some of you may be surprised. I know I was when I first learned this. I think of Bambi as a children's story. It's most famous, of course, because of the animated Walt Disney movie that came out in the early 1940s. But you may not know that Bambi was originally written as an adult novel, and it was targeted for destruction and consigned to the flames by the Nazis, who viewed it not only because the author was Jewish, but because it was regarded as a parable about the treatment of Jews in Europe. And I would love to refer you all earlier this year. There was a great piece in the New Yorker magazine. You can see it online about Bambi and its history, partly because there was only one translation of it available until, as I mentioned, it was published in 1922. It's now 100 years old. It's entered the public domain in terms of copyright, and there is a new translation. If you don't remember Bambi very well, it's about hunting and murder of Bambi's mother. Bambi is a deer, and it's been seen as an environmental book, but really also as a kind of allegory about persecution of Jews. So sort of that backdrop of the Nazi book burnings. I'd like to go to the next slide, though, and to what is surely the most famous, the most widely read book about, and also primary source from the period of the Holocaust, The Diary of Anne Frank. And it is also a book that is very frequently targeted for censorship, especially in school settings, but it is highly, highly translated. It was first published in 1947. Anne's diary has now been published in more than 70 different languages, regularly appears on lists of the most important or powerful or influential books of the 20th century, and it has been sold more than 30 million copies when I last checked. The Diary of Anne Frank is also a frequent target of Holocaust deniers. And in fact, there is kind of coded language that circulates online for deniers and for anti-Semitic speech. People will just write without context, ballpoint pen. That's an allegation, false allegation, that the diary was written in ballpoint pen, which was not invented at the time, and therefore it must be a forgery. So the Anne Frank diary is really a flashpoint in a lot of ways. And for many, many people, it is their first introduction to the Holocaust. The version of the diary that I read as a teenager, and that I imagine many of you read, and you may not have read it again in many years, is not the version that I'm showing you here in this cover. This is a definitive version that included a lot of parts that were edited or censored out. And Anne Frank's cousin, Buddy Elias, as you can see here, has described this more fulsome version, and I'm going to go into what's been excised and what's been put back in over the years and why. But he describes this diary as it's really her, that it shows her in a truer light, not as a saint, but as a girl like every other girl. She was nothing, actually. People try to make a saint out of her and glorify her, but that she was not. She was an ordinary, normal girl with a talent for writing. So one thing that is really fascinating and that you may know is that the first person to censor or cut out passages of Anne Frank's diary was Anne herself. Anne began keeping this diary in 1942, and she really had aspirations to be a professional published writer. And from late May 1944 until the residents of the secret annex in Amsterdam were betrayed and captured, from that summer, Anne spent a lot of time rewriting large portions of this diary. She planned to publish a book about her time in the secret annex after the war. She came up with a title, Het Achterhuis, or the secret annex, and she made different versions and really edited it to take out controversial or personal or explicit passages. So kind of sanitizing or sugarcoating parts of Anne's words was actually something she did herself. What are some of the differences in the versions, in the most commonly published and early published version, and now this more comprehensive version that we've had access to in the last number of years? Things like Anne is kinder in the way that she describes her mother. She had a difficult, argumentative relationship with her mother, like many teenage girls, but even more so, obviously, in the intense isolation of being in hiding, of being afraid. And she kind of smoothed that out in her version that she planned for publication. Her edited version also was less explicit sexually, both about her kind of budding romance with Peter Van Pels, who was the teenage boy living in the annex with her, and a lot of other things related to puberty, to body changes. But if we can go to the next slide, once the war was over and Anne did not survive, that she died in spring 1945 of typhus in the Bergen-Belsen camp. The next person to edit it was the man we see here, her father, Otto, who was given the diary, and actually it was more than one journal, was given to him after the war. And he reflected actually years later, in 1967, The Eternal Light, which was a TV show that was co-produced actually by JTS, by the Jewish Theological Seminary, and NBC. And you can see a video clip of this on YouTube if you're interested. He reflects what it felt like for him as a father to read his daughter's private journals later. And he said, I knew that Anne wrote a diary, but I must say I was very much surprised about the deep thoughts Anne had. It was quite a different Anne than I had known as my daughter. And my conclusion is that most parents don't really know their children. And he had some decisions to make, Otto Frank did, when he was submitting the diary for publication, both in terms of protecting the privacy, maybe the dirty laundry or more intimate, painful memories of his daughters and his wife, none of whom were alive to weigh in on what version of their lives would be presented publicly, but also what would be palatable to an audience. There was no guarantee, especially as early as 1947, that a publisher would want to put out a book like this and that there would be any public appetite for it. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to give a couple of examples. Here we have an image of one of the diaries itself, with a kind of cute cloth cover, a lock, and an image of Anne from not long before she went into hiding. So the most frequently quoted diary entry of any from Anne Frank appears, and if you're looking in your source packet, this is source number 6, but I will read parts of it aloud so you don't have to go back and forth. Something that she wrote only a few weeks before their capture, although of course she could not know this, a diary entry from July 15th, 1944. I'll just read a little bit of this from number 6. It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us, she means young people, only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. It's utterly impossible for me to build my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. And she skips ahead. I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I will be able to realize them. Now, it's really no surprise that people would find words like these inspiring, that a girl, a young woman, a teenager, physically hiding for her life in terror for years, could still have some form of optimism, some form of aspiration and hope for the future. This is a pleasant message to receive. And people have come up with all sorts of reasons why Anne Frank's diary is such a touchstone as a text, both because of her talents as a writer, because there are many, many dozens and hundreds actually of young people's diaries from the period of the Holocaust that are not as well written and that do not have kind of feel-good passages like this. But to reduce Anne Frank to this kind of saccharine even version is to really do her an injustice. There is a lot of anger in her diary, and there is a lot of complicated feelings that teenagers have. She, as I said, talks about arguments with her mother. There are also parts that are kind of not so goody-goody, I would say. And actually, just as a side note, I have sometimes wondered if part of why Anne Frank is also so popular and famous is that her name works really well and is easy to pronounce, and not particularly Jewish either, and works in lots of different languages. I imagine many of you will not have seen this. Just in the last few years, there are actually additional writings of Anne's that were recovered using forensic techniques from part of her diary. These are things that she felt were not suitable for prime time. She did not want her family to see these things and had covered parts of her diary with brown paper. And underneath it had written a bunch of kind of dirty jokes, off-color jokes. I included one of them in your source packet as source number 4. Source number 4 is one of these recently recovered diary entries from September 1942. She had said, "I'll use this spoiled page to write down dirty jokes." An example of one is, "Do you know why the German Wehrmacht girls are in the Netherlands? The German army girls are in the Netherlands as mattresses for the soldiers." That is far cry from the kind of cheery, inspirational, I believe people are good at heart. It's a little bit edgy. It's certainly not polite. It's a little bit angry. Probably the most frequently censored part, or the reason that people object most to the expanded definitive diary of Anne Frank, though, has to do with things she wrote that were very explicit about her changing body, about her feelings, about menstruation, exploring her own feelings of sexuality, because she was going through normal adolescent changes in a totally abnormal setting. And if we can go to the next slide, this is actually a magazine article that Anne had put up on the wall of the room where she slept in the secret annex in their hiding place. It is a copy of a magazine that she enjoyed reading. And I included a long excerpt, which I will not read it all to you. This is number 7 in the source packet, a diary entry that she wrote on January 5th, 1944. She liked to read columns by a woman named Sis Heister. This is a magazine that still exists in the Netherlands as a popular women's magazine. Along with food and other supplies, the helpers who took care of the Franks and the others in hiding brought them reading material for entertainment. And Sis Heister was a known psychologist who wrote pretty modern, progressive pieces about womanhood and girlhood. And Anne loved these and put them up on the wall along with pinups of movie stars that she liked and things that she thought were fashionable. And if you look at source number 7, she talks about an article she read about blushing and about puberty and girls thinking about the changes in their bodies. And she talks about how she feels, how she is really proud and embracing becoming a woman, that she actually likes getting her period, that she remembers feeling kind of sexual attraction toward a friend of hers. And this passage has become a flashpoint, along with some others, for people who would restrict especially sexual type material in school literature, even if it gives you this more fulsome and realistic sense of the person writing it. And according to the American Library Association, Diary of Anne Frank is the 62nd most banned book of the past 10 years. That may not sound very high, but it means there is a consistent pattern of parents and some teachers wanting to keep it out of schools. Some have said that they didn't like it because they thought it was sexually offensive, but I want you to also know that it's not just that, it's also the more core Holocaust content that has offended some people, with some saying that it might be depressing for young readers. Yes, it should be depressing. For example, in 1982, parents in Wise County, Virginia, complained about the book on the kind of sexual grounds. But in 1983, several members of an official state committee in Alabama called for the rejection of the diary because, and I quote, "it is a real downer." Interestingly, some educators I know don't like the Diary of Anne Frank very much as a text for teaching because they feel in a way it's not enough of a downer. Anne Frank is in mortal danger, but most of her life doesn't actually have the brutality or the violence, let's say, of ghettos or concentration camps. So in some ways, it's kind of out of time and out of space. But it has had a number of complaints and challenges through the American Library Association. In 1998, for example, it was removed from a middle school in Corpus Christi, Texas. Parents felt that it was pornographic. But it was interesting because students then, the people who would actually read it, waged a letter writing campaign to keep it, and it was kept. More recently, in Culpeper County, Virginia, not far from where I live, a lone parent complained that the book had sexually explicit material, homosexual themes, and they stopped assigning it. So I want to bring this up because it's indicative of a more dangerous trend that we see around the US, that sometimes one or two actors, one or two very vocal parents can cause a lot of problems. So I'll end this section and then open to some questions with source number 8 in your packet, what is actually the second to last piece of writing that we ever have from Anne, a diary entry, again, number 8 in your packet, from July 21st, 1944, where she said, "Forgive me, Kitty," which she calls her diary Kitty. "They don't call me a bundle of contradictions for nothing." So Anne Frank, the poster child for so many for the Holocaust, when we look at her in her full complexity, often makes people uncomfortable. And I'll be happy to take some questions if you can send them, let's see, to Julia Andelman, to Rabbi Andelman online, then she can send them to me.
Thank you. There were a few questions about Bambi, and people, it was interesting that you started there, and people were a little unclear on what was behind that ban and what the context was. If you could just elaborate on that.
Sure. So there were two reasons that Bambi was destroyed and burned by the Nazis, partly because of having a Jewish author, Felix Salten, but also more likely and more important was that the plot of Bambi was seen as some kind of allegory or analogy for the treatment of Jews in Europe. So that although the book is on its surface about deer, and about deer who are tormented and hunted and vulnerable, it was perceived by many readers, and therefore also by Nazi Germany, as being a not very well-veiled criticism of what it was like to be a Jew in Europe in the interwar period. So the Nazi book burnings included all kinds of books that had no Jewish connection, but also had messages like that were seen as threatening. So for example, All Quiet on the Western Front, or books by Helen Keller, or books by Hemingway that were seen as pacifist. So it was sort of that kind of threatening and unacceptable message that made Bambi a banned text.
Can you give us a little bit of context, since you started with Anne Frank, which you noted is the most widely known text from the Holocaust? How did it, or we're talking about sort of all the different sources of shutting it down that you noted for a variety of different reasons. How did it kind of emerge, and did it take quickly? Was it a slow process? I know it was. I know, you know, back when I was a kid, it was already kind of a staple. Was there? I guess the question vis-a-vis censorship is really, were these objections there from the beginning, or it was more? It was such a compelling text that the objections kind of only came later.
So I should have been clearer about it. More of the objections came later because it was only later that less edited, that fuller versions of it were published. And I'm talking about after you would have read it in school, Julia, like in the 2000s that the definitive edition comes out. People did not like it earlier, and the earliest complaints that I could find came from the 80s, that people found that it was, as I said, like, you know, depressing or a downer. But it was really once that the kind of artificially sanitized portrait of Anne as some kind of just, some have said even kind of Christian, turn the other cheek, hopeful, not angry portrait began to be complicated, and the full sense of Anne came out, that people then felt uncomfortable with it. And I think actually it's the shift from what people were reading in the 70s, let's say 70s and 80s, of the kind of more palatable, simpler Anne. I think some people also don't like it because it betrays their sense of who they thought they were reading. They thought that she was this particular kind of simpler, cheerier worldview, and instead she actually, like all human beings, is more complicated, more ambiguous, more ambivalent herself. But the interview that I mentioned from the Eternal Light show with Otto Frank was from 1967. He was interviewed on the occasion when they opened the Anne Frank House as a museum, as a place that you can visit in the Netherlands. And that really, the book was read before, it was a Broadway play before, but it's really in the 70s and 80s that we see Holocaust education kind of blossom as a field. And that's when she really explodes as a literary star.
Thank you. Let's see if we can squeeze in 2 more questions specifically about Anne Frank. One was, someone was asking if the Jewish content, this person was under the impression that the Jewish content was censored or minimized by the publisher or by Otto Frank, or essentially by the filmmakers later on, to make for a more universalistic message.
Yes and no. I would say that yes, in that, as I mentioned, even, her name, and that's her real name, is Anneliese Frank, but still it's a very palatable kind of neutral sounding name. And certainly in versions like movies or the Broadway play, she's turned into kind of a universal heroine. But I would also say just that the Frank family was not itself particularly observant. Theirs was not a life that was steeped in Judaism and Jewish text or other things. So it's not that that was cut out, but a lot of it is not there in the diary. I also want to remind ourselves that we are, when we look at that book, we are looking at a diary of a young person who is developing. And so when Anne herself, as I said, was her first editor, was her first censor, it's not just what did she think was kind of too messy or ugly to put out in public, but we have to remember that when she goes back to edit herself in the summer of 1944, she's a 15-year-old girl looking back at what she wrote when she was 13. And I would challenge any of us to look and see things that we wrote when we were younger that don't make us cringe. So some of it might have been for a public audience, and also just that she had changing sensibilities. And then Otto Frank felt understandably protective of his daughter, of both his daughters and his murdered wife after the war, and also had reason to want to present a kind of nicer, shinier part. So that's one reason I like to make it clear that it's not only people now for whom the diary might be uncomfortable, but also the people closer to it had mixed feelings.
Thank you. Okay, and so maybe last question on Anne Frank's diary. So I think we may not all each know which version we read back when we read it, but one person was saying that they thought in terms of sexually explicit material, that it's pretty tame compared to a lot of what comes out today, even in the YA, the young adult genre. So the person was asking, is that maybe an excuse for kind of other motivations for censoring it, or do you think that's a genuine objection? I mean, it is a genuine. You explained why it's a genuine objection, but is that sort of also a screen for anti-Semitic or other kinds of Holocaust denying motivations for censoring the book or banning the book?
I mean, look, who knows what goes on in the head of someone who's trying to ban a book like this. But I think I have not seen explicitly anti-Semitic parts in it. I think it maybe more has to do, and again, I'm just being like an armchair psychologist here, with people who feel that they had a familiar, comfortable version of Anne Frank that they grew up knowing or liked, and then suddenly that is shattered when their kid comes home. And teenagers love to focus on the juiciest, most uncomfortable, and sometimes beside the point part of a story, of a movie or a book. And I've had students say to me, "Isn't Anne Frank a lesbian?" Because she talks about wanting to touch her friend's breasts or something. Like, that's not the point of the diary. It's just someone exploring and having feelings, and who knows and who cares. So I think for many parents, I think it is part of to object. It's part of a larger censoring, especially of sexually explicit material. But a lot of times I think it's also a discomfort with what they thought was a safe book, and one that gave a particular message, and then one that turns out to be more complicated, more angry, more controversial than the kind of poster girl that they thought. So, but I don't really see it as being anti-Semitic.
So it's a great way to start, or kind of first material to focus on, since not only is it the most widely read, but there are kind of all these different complicated angles of why people might want to suppress all or part of the book that you've raised. So we can go on. You want to go on to your next sources?
Sure. And I do want to just to return for a second for the people who asked about Bambi. Again, in this past January in the New Yorker, there's a terrific article online about the new translation and how it's so much more complicated, and also that the author Felix Salten also ghost wrote what was a really sensationalist kind of child pornographic novel at the time. Like, he was seen as subversive and degenerate in other ways. And I didn't know any of that about Bambi. And I'm going to guess that most of us did not. So go check that out with the New Yorker. Just look up New Yorker Bambi from this year. Well, thank you. Ellie has put the link there. But okay, back to banned Holocaust books. If we can, Tani, go back to the next slide. Another book, Sophie's Choice, both the novel and then multiple Oscar-winning movie starring Meryl Streep, Kevin Kline. She won Best Actress for it. I think it's a really terrific book. If you've not read it, just as a novel, it's really interesting. It's really well written. But I pulled out a few excerpts from it in your source packet, where William Styron has some very astute and I think uncomfortable observations about the Holocaust. In number 9 in your packet, I think germane to a lot of what I'm showing you today, he has actually Stingo, who's one of the main characters. Stingo is seeing a therapist, a psychologist, and the psychologist says to him that the repressiveness of a society in general is directly proportionate to its harsh repression of sexual language. So I think that goes back to some of the questions that you asked about Anne Frank, is maybe discomfort or desire to censor sexual language or sexual content is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, when there are other things in a book or in a movie that make us uncomfortable. And I think some of the language in Sophie's Choice, and it has most often been banned or objected to based on being sexually explicit. For example, it was banned in South Africa. The book was in 1979 because of its sexual material. More recently, in a high school in La Mirada, California, there was also a complaint about it, and it was pulled from that school library. But I would venture to say that it's some of the other messages in it that are much more uncomfortable for people. For example, and I'll read some of these quotes in case you don't have the source there. Styron wrote, "Military men are capable of abominable crimes. Witness in our recent time alone, Chile, My Lai, Greece. But it is a liberal fallacy that equates the military mind with real evil and makes it the exclusive province of lieutenants or generals. The secondary evil, of which the military is frequently capable, is aggressive, romantic, melodramatic, thrilling, orgasmic. Real evil, the suffocating evil of Auschwitz, gloomy, monotonous, barren, and boring, was perpetrated almost exclusively by civilians. And Styron also goes on to talk about that if you really try to make peace with evil, slavery wasn't bad, everything is God's fault, and other truths that I think make people uncomfortable. Next slide, please. I want to also draw our attention to the fact that it's not only books about the Holocaust that draw objections, but also movies and TV. And we see here Meryl Streep, who for a while seems to have only done Holocaust-related things. She also starred in 1978 in the 4-part miniseries that appeared on NBC, Holocaust, which won a lot of Emmys. I know I remember watching it with my family as a kid, even though in retrospect, I was probably a little young to watch that, but maybe that explains how I ended up in the line of work I am. I found a review from that April from Tom Shales, who's a TV critic for the Washington Post, writing about what he called television, the good news machine, departs from its role as national comforter tonight when NBC begins the 4-night telecast of Holocaust, a 9.5-hour film drama on one of the most discomforting of all possible topics, Nazi persecution and extermination of Jews. It's hard to imagine television drama more demanding or rewarding. And so TV starts taking on this role of teaching and exposing the American public to Holocaust material, whether in fictionalized form or in true history parts, like an original primary source like Anne Frank. So if we could go to the next slide. In 1993, and I imagine this image is recognizable to you, it's kind of an iconic image from Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, which came out as a movie in 1993, swept the Academy Awards. But in February of 1997, it was on TV. NBC aired it without commercial interruption on a Sunday night, and 65 million people tuned in to watch it. 25 million people had seen Schindler's List when it was initially released in theaters. But that night, the Nielsen ratings showed that more than 1/3 of American homes who were watching TV that night tuned in to watch Schindler's List. Interestingly, as a side note, the broadcast, because it's commercial for-profit company, they need advertising dollars. It was sponsored by the Ford Motor Company, which is interesting and sort of ironic given founder Henry Ford's virulent and vocal anti-Semitism himself in the 20s, 30s, 40s. But Ford Motor Company did the right thing in 97 and sponsored that broadcast. So as I said, hugely popular, 65 million people watching it on this Sunday night, but it resulted in an angry reaction from a congressman. If we can go to the next slide. Oh, actually, sorry, go back to Schindler's List. I thought I had an excerpt in the slide. So if we could go back to the girl, please. Thank you. Representative Tom Coburn, a Republican from Oklahoma, who was chairman at the time of a kind of congressional family caucus, his office issued a public statement saying, "This TV broadcast of Schindler's List was an all-time low, with full frontal nudity, violence, and profanity being shown in our homes. The fact that it aired on public television on a Sunday evening during a family time should outrage parents and decent-minded individuals everywhere. I cringe when I realize that there were children all across this nation watching this program. They were exposed to the violence of multiple gunshot head wounds, vile language, full frontal nudity, and irresponsible sexual activity. It simply should not have been allowed on public television." Now, I will say that Representative Congressman Coburn very quickly came to regret issuing this statement. He was called to task on the floor of Congress, very quickly backpedaled and apologized and said he was wrong. But I think it kind of gets to the crux of what a lot of objections are about Holocaust books. It's that it's brutal. It's a lot of unpleasantness. It's violent. It's degrading, it's dehumanizing, and it is at its base, extremely uncomfortable. I keep using that word, but it is uncomfortable to watch, to read, to hear about, and it should be. And I think it gets at what Tom Coburn said, gets at some deeper discomforts, that we don't want to look at the fact that human beings can do this to other human beings, that this occurred in modern Europe, that the United States stood by and did nothing for years, many, many unpleasant and ugly truths, and the full frontal nudity, which is not sexual in any way, the gunshot wounds, those are all symptomatic of the deeper troubling part about the history. I'm going to turn to what is the second most popular book about the Holocaust in the next slide, and that would be Elie Wiesel's Night, which is a memoir, but also stylistically is written in a very artistic form, is not written in the first person. He creates a character of Eliezer. But to talk a little bit to the question also of when do Holocaust books become popular and how do their fortunes and reception change over time. When Night was first published in the United States in 1960, it took 3 years to sell the first print run, which was 3,000 books. So it took 3 years to sell 3,000 books. By 1997, Night had become very popular, very frequently assigned in middle schools and high schools, was selling around 300,000 copies every year. And then in 2006, Oprah Winfrey selected it as a recommended book from her book club, and she traveled to the site of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp with Elie Wiesel, and that skyrocketed the book into another level. It sat in the #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list for its category for a year and a half. And it has sold over 10 million copies now and continues to be one of the most widely taught books around the world. But what is some of the history of this book, and how has it been censored, altered, suppressed, edited to make it palatable, to make it the type of book that could have that kind of extraordinary popularity? Next slide. Here we're looking at a picture of the young Elie Wiesel, and in personal writings that he was writing in 1954, so we're talking about 9 years after the liberation, he was on a ship sailing from France to Brazil, and he wrote that it was important to testify, to stop the dead from dying and to justify my own survival. In Buenos Aires, he gave an original manuscript that he had written in Yiddish to a publisher, and it first came out in 1956 as Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, which means and the world remained silent. So that in and of itself, just looking at the title, and I'll give you a couple of examples, is a very different title from Night. Night is kind of enigmatic, abstract, you don't know what's in it, and the world remains silent. Und die Welt hat geschwiegen is an accusatory title. It is an angry title. It is one about a person who feels betrayed and that his people were betrayed. It was actually one of a number of memoirs that came out as a series. And so he was part of an established genre. It might not have turned into anything particularly noteworthy or unusual, but Wiesel significantly reworked his account. He cut it down heavily. He took out some passages that were more Jewish and less and more angry. And it came out in 1960 in a French version called La Nuit, or Night. And that's the edition, the basis of many translations, came out. One thing that's very interesting is if you look, Elie Wiesel had said that he thought he needed to wait 10 years after the liberation to kind of let his brain assimilate and digest what had happened. But the Yiddish version has a totally different accounting of it. He writes in it that he stayed in bed for several days, and he was in Buchenwald in the infirmary after liberation, jotting down notes for this. So the Yiddish version is unapologetically immediate. And as I said, it was part of this series. It was the 117th volume in a series called Das Polnische Judentum, Jews of Poland. But then it is changed into La Nuit. And if you look later or now at number 13, I have a long excerpt, which I will not read to you, from George Borchardt, who was the person, the agent who pushed for it to be published in America. And he talks about how difficult it was to get it published in the United States, and that publishers, Simon & Schuster, Dutton, Knopf, all of them said, no, this book is not for us. We are not going to publish it. But it does come out. Okay, next slide. So what are some of the differences in the versions of the book? Let me jump ahead and see. So for example, let me give you some comparison. And we're looking here at covers from the Yiddish version, from the early French version, La Nuit. I'll just give you a parallel version of Yiddish, French, and English of one passage. He's writing about after liberation and what are some of the survivors doing. And Wiesel writes that these young men survivors, they only thought about food. And this is number 17 in your source packet if you want to follow along, number 17. They only thought about food, not about revenge, not about their parents, only about bread. And even when they had satisfied their hunger, they still did not think about revenge. Then in the Yiddish version from 1956, it goes on and says, early the next day, Jewish boys ran off to the town of Weimar to steal clothing and potatoes and to rape German girls. Und zu vergewaltigen deutsche Schicksals. The historical commandment of revenge was not fulfilled. In the French version, La Nuit, it says, le lendemain, quelques jeunes gens coururont à Weimar, ramasser des pommes de terre et des habits, et coucher avec des filles, mais de vengeance, pas de trace. And that is almost identical to the English translation I'll give you here. As translated by Stella Rodway, it says, on the following morning, some of the young men went to Weimar to get some potatoes and clothes and to sleep with girls. But of revenge, not a sign. So you can see this very sanitized version that in the Yiddish, the boys are angry, they're criminal. They're going to steal things. They're going to take whatever they want by force, clothing, potatoes. They're going to violently rape girls, German girls. And when it says the historical commandment of revenge was not fulfilled, Wiesel means that like this is not an appropriate revenge. It is not commensurate with what they are trying to avenge. But in the French and English versions, it is totally cleaned up. They go to get potatoes and clothes, not to take them. There may be sowing wild oats or having fun with girls, but they're not rapists. They're not attacking, and they are not angry. There is no sign of revenge. Next slide, please. So that I think, and I could give you many, there are long articles about this, especially by Naomi Seidman, wrote a terrific article about the kind of repression of the anger and the revenge in Night. But how do people react to this? So I have here on the slide, and this is a number 14 on your source sheet. There's a very popular books website called Goodreads, where people give reviews of books and discuss books. And a parent wrote in and said about Night, this is very recent, I am very upset that this book, Night, is on a list as appropriate for 14-year-old 8th graders. Because it is, my son is being forced to read it by his school. My family is deeply affected by this book. My son is in emotional upheaval and very depressed. And this book should not be listed as appropriate for this age group. It should be read at the high school level. How could a book like this end up on the list? And another reader named John, so this is just organic conversation among readers, said, Wiesel was younger than your son when he experienced Night. Think about that. Of course, part of education, perhaps the most important part, is learning about and confronting history, and hiding from it is not healthy. that the language is plain and clear. And if you're worried about it, you should ask the teacher how they're going to teach it. So I think that is kind of encapsulates, again, here, this is not a book where it's either because of sexual content at all, but just that it is very, very disturbing to read about deportation, to read about life in a death camp, to read about a death march. These are upsetting things. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll talk about this in a second, but just to give you some sense of the objections tonight, where people do not have sexual material to use as kind of a smoke screen for why they don't like it, but in fact just need to say that it makes them feel bad. They don't like it. They want to shield their kids from ugliness or from genocide or from anti-Semitism. There's a national coalition against censorship. It's a nonprofit group. They have reported that a school district in Conejo Valley, California, that representatives from a local middle school noted they have a policy there where if parents don't like a book, they can opt out. Representatives from this middle school said that so many families had opted out from reading night, from their student reading night, that the teacher was unable to teach the book to the rest of the class. And this is not the only case like that. Anyway, I have a lot more in the source packet about night, but I'm going to go on now. But I do want to point you also again to Naomi Seidman's article about the scandal of Jewish rage and night, because I have found that very, very helpful. Okay. I'm going to do one more thing and then I'll pause again for questions. So let's come up to the present day, very recent, this fall. In August 2022, there was an amendment in the state of Missouri. There was an amendment to a state Senate bill, Missouri State Senate Bill number 775, and I have this as source number 12 in your packet if you want to look at it. And thank you, Ellie. She has given the list to Naomi Seidman's article. There is an amendment that says that there can be criminal penalties if a person in Missouri who is affiliated, who is a school teacher or administrator, is assigning or loaning, so this means a librarian, a teacher, course, any kind of material that has explicit sexual material in it. And what is the result of this that has come out just this fall? So there are hundreds of books that a handful of school districts in Missouri then remove from their shelves since the start of this school year. And a number of them are books about the Holocaust that are geared toward young readers. So I'm showing you a couple of them here. One of them is a Time Life series. You know, they have kind of popular history versions. One here on the right about Holocaust resistance. A book on the left called The Apparatus of Death. Most of the objections seem to be that there are photographs from the Holocaust period and from liberation that show camp prisoners naked or in various states of undress. Again, kind of absurd to think about because this is not sexual, but that is the ostensible reason that those books were pulled. Also pulled was Art Spiegelman's book Mouse, which I'm going to spend the last part of my session talking about, but they pull them away. They take these off the shelves. And this is in response to this law that is supposedly dealing with child trafficking and sexual abuse. But it also orders possible jail time for any educators who are found to be in violation of it. And so as a result, books that have nothing to do with sex, but happen to have some naked people in them, and also unpleasant history, like the Holocaust, are pulled. There are also other books, though, that are purged from the shelves that are not Holocaust related, but some that also have other kind of Jewish themes. For example, schools in St. Louis banned a kind of graphic novel biography of Jewish socialist radical Emma Goldman. It's called A Dangerous Woman. They took it out. Also some books by artists like Marc Chagall, Alfred Stieglitz, a whole bunch of books kind of fall victim to this. And it's sort of ironic because Missouri's governor just earlier this year signed a statewide Holocaust education mandate into law. So there are these competing forces leaving teachers and librarians in a very tenuous situation where they are betwixt and between. So I'm going to pause there to see what other kinds of questions we have before I go on to talk about mouse. So if you have any questions about mouse, please hold those. And let's see what's on your minds.
Lots of questions. First, a number of people asked if it is possible to get that original, Elie Wiesel's original version in English now.
I don't know off the top of my head. I haven't looked for that. So I don't know, but let me see.
Okay, so let's say if we find it, we will add it to this to the source sheet online after the fact.
But it's so interesting, isn't it? Like, I think just looking passage by passage, you're like, whoa, like this is an entirely different worldview that's being presented.
Yeah, and it's hard to imagine Oprah doing the same thing, even with the title, the different title that you shared.
Yep.
Okay. So I think that Tom Coburn passed away actually a couple of years ago, but the question is, do you think that if he or someone like, or someone else, another member of Congress were to make the same critique today, that they would be blasted to the same degree that he was then?
I don't know. I mean, there are so many things that are like, if you, I did a program with a woman who is in charge of combating book banning and book censorship efforts for the American Library Association last spring, and I can share that link with you if you want. And to see the kinds of things that are objected on, like there's a book, an illustrated children's book called The Shyest Fish in the Sea. It's about seahorses, and people object to it because in nature, the male seahorse is the one that carries the young, the one that is pregnant. And so people objected by saying this is somehow promoting a trans lifestyle. I mean, the basis on which people object to books is so absurd that I actually think maybe Tom Coburn would not apologize today. But, you know, I can't speak for the dead. I think it was absurd what he did originally, but it certainly, he realized it was not a smart thing to say. But I feel like people are so, and I don't want to say just only on one side of the political spectrum. I mean, I was just reading something last night about, it's the 50th anniversary of the record and show Free to Be You and Me, which is about as liberal, crunchy, egalitarian as it gets. And people who are objecting to it because they say it's showing gender roles and there should not be any gender. So I think we're just living in an increasingly intolerant society where people don't like to be around anything that makes them feel uncomfortable. Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, there was a question about what do the child psychologists or other professionals say, if you know, about what is actually the appropriate age to be exposed to this kind of disturbing material? Meaning, is there actually some validity to, of course, we want to protect our children. We also want to teach them about the world and have them have a sense of history to understand the present and all of that. But is there actually some validity to that urge to delay exposure to this kind of graphic Holocaust memoir?
From what I know, and I've been in the field of Holocaust education for a long time, two things are true. One is that shock is not an effective way to communicate anything educationally, that by showing someone the most gruesome thing you can is not necessarily going to actually lead to critical thinking or open-mindedness. And so for that reason, all responsible Holocaust educators I know and organizations completely reject the idea, for example, of simulations. Like we've heard of some well-intentioned but misguided teachers trying to do things where some of the students are supposed to be Nazis and some are Jews, and they've locked kids in closets and does all kind, like, that is legitimately terrible. It is, sorry, I have a kid with COVID calling me. It is both traumatic and inappropriate. That said, and the guideline that we use at the Holocaust Museum is that, you know, allowing for individual differences in child development, and each parent knows their own kid and their sensitivities. The guideline is age 11 and up, you can really be exposed to the reality of the Holocaust in a responsible, contextualized way. And our children's exhibit, Daniel's story, is for ages 8 and up, which has less graphic violence, but still goes into a lot of the concepts of targeting of a group and anti-Semitism and what the reality was like. But I think that's part of the difficulty, is that Anne Frank was seen as a safe book for a long time, and then looking at it in its entirety, which teenagers might seek out on their own, makes it less easy to control. But really the onus is on a teacher to teach the material in a contextualized, supportive way. And I don't think that it is age inappropriate. And the sexual material is the least age inappropriate part. That's what teenagers are thinking about and wondering about in puberty and bodies. And what people should really be disturbed about is what it says about human nature and about what happened on this planet and what human beings and governments allowed to happen. And too often they're not complaining about that. And certainly I say this as a parent of middle schooler and high schooler, middle schooler can absolutely and should have that conversation.
So you just made a clear and concise argument for why it's important to, or the value of sharing this material in a classroom setting with the guidance of a teacher. The question is, or a question is, when these books are banned, do you know, does it, the overall impact, does it actually drive readership up because, oh, I want to go read the forbidden thing, or does it really mean that fewer people are reading it?
Generally, it drives readership up. And in the last few minutes we have, I'll talk about Mouse just as an example, because that did amazing things for sales of Art Spiegelman's Mouse this year. But yeah, and especially for teenagers, what would you more want to read than something that your parents say you cannot, or your teacher says you cannot? You will find a way to get that stuff. So,
right, but not with the so that's good to hear, but not with the kind of guidance, the educational guidance that you shared. But okay,
absolutely. And when you rather, they get it in a good way. So
yeah. Okay, I have more questions, but you just called my attention to the time, so I'm going to stop and we'll come back to remaining questions at the end.
Okay, and I appreciate, I saw a few people clap and thumbs up for that. I fully believe it too. So, okay, next slide, please. So can talk about the elephant in the room or the other animals in the room, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which was in the news this year in a big way. And if we can pull up the slide, for anyone who may not be familiar with Mouse, although I'm going to guess on this call, a lot of people have read it, but I know my own husband has not, despite my bugging him to read it. Tani, can we get the slides, please? Mouse.
Yeah, I'm pulling them up. Just one second.
Beautiful. Thank you. Mouse is, I wouldn't even call it a graphic novel because it is illustrated, but it is true. It is 2 volumes, sometimes now published together as The Complete Mouse, by the author and cartoon artist Art Spiegelman, who is the son of 2 Holocaust survivors. He published volume 1, My Father Bleeds History, and the second, And Here My Troubles Began. And then it comes out as The Complete Mouse. And it won the Pulitzer Prize. It has been a hugely influential book. For those of you who have not read it, all of the characters are drawn as animals, with Jewish characters portrayed as mice, Germans portrayed as cats, Americans as dogs. A lot of people were perplexed this year. And actually, let's go to another couple slides, because in case people haven't seen it, I want to make sure you know what the book is talking about. So for example, in this slide that we have here, and I've just chosen a kind of random few panels from it, you see the Jews are mice, portrayed on the right, and that this is from a part after liberation. So the cat-faced woman is a German woman who's angry, and behind her in the helmet is a dog who's an American liberator. So in January 2022, a school board in McMinn County, Tennessee, voted to stop using mouse as a text in the 8th grade curriculum on several grounds, including that it contains sexually inappropriate material. Now, unlike in Europe, for example, in the United States, school boards have great discretion over curriculum, and they can make decisions because they can do it as long as it's under constitutional guidelines. So they got rid of this. To the question we had earlier, ironically, once it was removed, everyone wanted to read it. It got a lot of attention for Mouse that has been out for a long time. And I think people who had not heard of it before suddenly did. There was huge demand for it. It became the #1 book on Amazon's bestseller list. Bookstores all over the US and online were selling out of Mouse and ordering more, and lots of organizations bought copies of Mouse for people in McMinn County in Tennessee. So let's talk a little bit about what they were objecting to and on what grounds. If we can go to the next slide. So on the left, we have one, and these are not, I want to make clear, these are not these panels do not show sequentially in the book. I took different excerpts. The one on the left is a scene from a concentration camp where you have the Nazi cat on the right yelling, "Shut up, yids," to the bathhouse quick. And you can see naked mice. They're, anthropomorphized. They look like human beings with mouse heads, but they have genitalia. You can see it. They are stripped naked as part of a degradation process. And then the panels that I'm showing you on the right are very typical scenes of what violence looks like in this book. So cartoonish type violence, like in the upper left, you can see a Jew, a mouse character, being hit with a big comic book kind of crack, like you would see, in an old time Superman or Spider-Man cartoon by a pig who would be either a Polish character or a capo, a collaborator Jew. And then in the next slide, this is the main image that was objected to. So Art Spiegelman is writing a memoir of his extremely tormented relationship with his parents, who have a lot of trauma and psychological damage as a result of their wartime experience, including that they had a son, a little boy, who did not survive the war. And in this, there's a book within the book that Art Spiegelman is showing, where he talks about how this is in real life, his mother, after years of mental illness and trauma, slits her wrists and takes pills and dies by suicide. And this is the image that some people find objectionable because it shows his father in a horrifying scene finding his dead wife in a bathtub, and her bare breasts, as drawn in a comic, are exposed. Okay, next slide. Here a little bit about the kind of sanitization. So I'll read you. You have these in your source packet too. If you go to sources around source 20, this is source 21, 22. So you see Art Spiegelman as a mouse at an artist's drawing board, and he is drawing with a pile of dead corpses in front of him, so that he is surrounded by the ghosts and the shadow of the atrocities of the Holocaust. And there are flies, these are decomposing bodies, and he's being approached by media. One is a German journalist on the left, you can see because he's wearing a mask of a cat, and on the right, American dog-faced media saying, "Tell our viewers what message you want them to get from your book." And he says, "A message? I don't know." Like he's just trying to sort out his own painful feelings. He says, "I never thought of reducing it to a message. I mean, I wasn't trying to convince anybody of anything. I just wanted," and he's interrupted by the German journalist, "Your book is being translated into German. Many younger Germans have had it up to here with Holocaust stories. These things happened before they were even born. Why should they feel guilty? And the Artie character says, who am I to say? He says, a lot of the corporations that flourished in Nazi Germany are richer than ever. I don't know. Maybe everyone has to feel guilty forever, forever. And then he has a Jewish journalist say, okay, let's talk about Israel. And the next panel, this does go on. It says, if your book was about Israeli Jews, what kind of animal would you draw? And he says, I have no idea. Porcupines? And then someone else shows up and says, Artie baby, check out this licensing deal. You get 50% of the profits. Mouse, you've read the book, now buy the vest. And he's just shrinking and becoming just a sad, grappling little boy who wants his mommy. So that's really what the book is about the burdens and the legacies and the scars of the Holocaust and how people want to make it about all kinds of other things. And then if we can go to the last slide, because I do want to leave the last few minutes for questions. This is from the actual school board minutes of that Tennessee school board where they were debating whether or not to remove Maus from their 8th grade curriculum. And one of the school board members says, and you have the longer, this is number 27 in your source packet. I have more of it there. He says, I'm not denying it that the Holocaust was horrible, brutal, and cruel. It's like when you're watching TV and a cuss word or nude scene comes on, it would be the same movie without it. Well, Maus would be the same book without it. I may be wrong, but this guy that created the artwork used to do the graphics for Playboy, which is true. Art Spiegelman used to write cartoons for Playboy. You can look at his history, and we're letting him do graphics in books for students in elementary school. If I had a child in the 8th grade, this ain't happening. If I had to move him out and homeschool him or put him somewhere else, this is not happening. So close the slides. Before we turn to questions, I'm just trying to give you a sense of, in my assessment of it, the different reasons that people object to Holocaust-related books. As we've said, sometimes it's based on sexual material, but usually that is kind of shorthand for a bigger sense of discomfort of what these kinds of books, especially something like Maus, which is so raw and holds no punches, what it confronts us with. And that the Holocaust is not easy or pleasant history to examine. And many people would rather that we pretend it doesn't exist, or that we pretend it exists, or that we accept it, but only in a form that is somehow life-affirming, the way the original Anne Frank was designed to be. So I would be happy to take more questions, and I hope you found this interesting.
Very interesting, and it feels so much like just the tip of the iceberg. So we'll get to as many questions as we can, and I just wanted, there's so many wonderful questions, and I'm just apologize to everyone whose questions we won't get to. I don't know, Dr. Friedberg, if you have a few, if you have, 4 or 5 extra minutes since we started.
I do, yeah.
Late. Okay, great.
And by the way, I want to just give a shout out to my former classmate from JTS, Vipka Light, who I see is watching. I haven't seen her in a long time, but ties from JTS endure a long, long time. Hi, Vipka.
Okay. There's a question about, someone asked, what do you think is the most significant misconception, or what are the most significant misconceptions about the Holocaust by school boards in the US? So I think I would just broaden it a little bit, and I jotted a note for myself as well. We've been talking about mostly about memoirs, not about textbooks and other kinds of Holocaust education. So I wonder, if you have thoughts on the state of things in that arena to share with us.
I mean, we did see a few books when I was talking about this new Missouri amendment that were not memoirs, that are really books that they're not textbooks, but they're designed for a youth audience. And that it seems like there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction against anything that seems either that it shows nudity or is too violent. So I think the misconception that we see, and it's in a minority of school boards, is that there's a way to talk about the Holocaust or teach about it that is not going to be disturbing or unpleasant. By definition, that's what it is, and it should be. But we're also seeing, and I think especially it's interesting to think about for this audience in the context of this session, that there's a sort of Christian worldview or Christian theology that is often overlaid on or put on Jews during the Holocaust and survivors after, and the way we look at it, that makes it more consistent with a worldview that's about forgiveness or turning the other cheek, or somehow also the idealization of Holocaust survivors as being somehow wonderful, saintly people just because they went through something difficult. So I think it's kind of a piece of that there's some sort of moral lesson to be drawn from the Holocaust, and that it's a comforting one. I think that has more to do with an American attitude about that. And I say that as the daughter of a survivor, like that just because you've been through something shitty doesn't necessarily make you, tolerant in all ways or compassionate in all ways. So I think it's bigger than school boards and has to do with how America likes to think about events. Even just that when you look back at World War II, that it's a lot more pleasant to think of America as the liberators of the camps, as opposed to also the country that did not let in hundreds of thousands of people whose lives could have been saved if we had different immigration policy. So I think it's related to that as well.
And it's taken so long for, for our curricula about, explorers and westward expansion and all of that to properly acknowledge what that meant for Native Americans. It's clearly a broad phenomenon. So related to that, I'm going to put a few questions together. There were questions about kind of, is there research on correlations between kind of geography or different socioeconomic or racial demographics? Are there correlations between certain regions and groups with the degree of censorship? And I'll just put in there, I'm sure you're not surprised people are asking about connections between censorship of Holocaust material with, reactions to what supposed critical race theory in books that touch on race. There are also questions about, is there any correlation with kind of the slow surfacing of kind of naming the Rwanda or the Armenian genocide? Is there any correlation to kind of talk about Rwandan genocide? These so I guess regional and socioeconomic and racial demographics and kind of correlations to discussion about genocide in the broader society is this broad question that I'm throwing at you.
Partly I'd say I don't know for sure, like a lot of what I know is anecdotal, but I can say that the objections to many of the books and movies that I talked about today span a lot of different geographic areas. So it's not a purely Southern thing. We have a lot of examples from California. And as I mentioned, we see it from the left and the right. It is more typically from the right and more typically aligned with settings where there are anxieties and restrictions on sexual related material as well, but not only. And also that there have been complaints and objections from more kind of progressive or woke kinds of factions that, like, why are we teaching about the Holocaust? Is it to the exclusion of other stories, like talking about slavery in this country or homophobic behavior? Or so that it doesn't come up as much in book bans, but in debates and struggles over curricula, for sure it's there. And I think you could probably find it in every state in the union. It has to do with more kind of intolerance generally and orthodoxy from different attitudes, the idea that no one should be forced to be uncomfortable at any time. And if that's the case, you're not going to study the Holocaust because it is profoundly uncomfortable.
Right. And we see a growth in discomfort with discomfort, both on the right and the left, as you're saying.
Yeah.
Are there Jewish efforts to, any Jewish efforts to, I don't know, kind of limit exposure to this material?
I don't think systematically. I do, again, anecdotally see through my work at the museum, but also as a parent with kids in day school and in public school, that parents more and more seem to want to shield their kids from difficult material generally and postpone the ages at which they're learning about things. And, you know, there's got to be a middle ground. I know many middle-aged people who were taught about the Holocaust at perhaps ages that were too young and in ways that were developmentally inappropriate. But I feel like the pendulum has swung pretty far the other way, and that my advice as an educator and as a parent is preempt your kids. Like, you may think you're going to be shielding them from something, but they're hearing about it anyway. They're hearing about it online, they're hearing about it in social media, they're hearing about it from their friends, and it's better for them to have those conversations with you. So whenever someone asks me what's my advice about at what age is it appropriate, it's when they start to ask questions, or if you feel they should be asking questions, the same way you would talk about cancer or anti-Semitism or terrorism or other things that might make them feel frightened or anxious. Better for them to have a guided conversation with trusted adults. And if you don't know the answers, it's okay. You can find them together. So that's my advice there.
I apologize for the lawnmower noise.
That's okay.
I just actually wanted to read a powerful comment that someone shared. So one of our participants wrote, "I'm not Jewish, but grew up surrounded by Jews in Westchester County, New York. In 1969, when I was 16, I had only a vague idea what the Holocaust was. My high school offered a documentary film about the Holocaust, and no student could attend without parental permission. So it was a big deal, and I wanted to go because I was a rebel. Without understanding the Holocaust, I got permission just because it was somewhat forbidden. The film explained the context and showed footage of horrific acts, gassing, corpses being dumped, etc. It was very graphic. It changed my life. I felt sick, but remember, I felt very grateful that it opened my mind."
Wow. Thank you for that. And it really encapsulates and validates a lot of what I've been trying to say today about kind of adolescent attitudes, and also the effect that learning about this history at this age can have even decades later. So thank you for sharing that.
Do you think that there are any books that should be banned from a perspective of anti-Semitism? Someone asked, do you think the protocols of the Elders of Zion should be banned?
Oh, I thought they were going to ask about Holocaust books, because I was going to say if I could.
A lot of people have asked about Ken Burns also and want to know what you think.
Because if I could ban from classroom any book related to the Holocaust, it would be Boy with the Striped Pajamas. It's a terrible book and totally sugarcoats and historically inaccurately presents in a bizarre way, like a fairy tale fable version. Protocols of the Elders of Zion. No, I mean, I'm very American in my free speech attitudes. I believe that with appropriate context, it's important to study books like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's important to study Mein Kampf. They circulate all over. And if we don't know what's in them, we can't recognize when they're being invoked. We can't talk about what makes them effective and how they are or are not recruiting tools for extremists and neo-Nazis and haters today. I think if my presentation has shown you anything, it's that control of information is an elusive and not very worthy goal. It's better to engage with it and to be part of the marketplace of ideas. So I think it's important to have them out there, but again, it needs to be done in a responsible way. I wouldn't just like give it to my 8th grader and go away. The Ken Burns film, I think it's really well done. A number of my friends and colleagues appear in it. I could quibble with particular conclusions or arguments in certain scenes, but that's really kind of insider boring baseball for historians. But I think it's really important. I'm very gratified that he and Lynn Novick and his other producers made this film, because it's, again, about looking in the mirror in uncomfortable ways and challenging what many Americans might think of as our role during the period of the 30s and 40s and what were some of our failures. So I applaud that. And also some of the survivors who appear in it are really wonderful people who volunteer at the museum, especially Susan Warsinger is someone who's quoted a lot. And I just very glad for more people to have her in their living rooms. So.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for teaching today. I expected something so different from this session. I really thought that you were going to be focusing on anti-Semitism, and really you're connecting censorship of Holocaust material to something much bigger than that, and much bigger than the Holocaust, much bigger than anything having to do with Jews, and really kind of changes in social discourse and what we're comfortable with, exposing our children to in terms of kind of protecting the kids from disturbing material. That I think that's my big takeaway from what you've shared today. That as that impulse has gone up, kind of irrespective of political leanings, so has the censorship and kind of the desire to ban Holocaust material gone up with it. So that's I have to that you really shed light on a lot of the contemporary moves out there for me. I imagine for other people as well. So thank you so much for sharing this with us and really giving us a new lens to think not only about reaction to these really important and disturbing, rightfully disturbing Holocaust memoirs and the other and kind of broader trends going on. Thank you so much for teaching us today. And I want to thank also Phyllis Levy again for your sponsorship. Thanks to everyone for joining us. And next week we have our own Ellie Gettinger on staff, who's going to be teaching us about the Hollywood blacklist from her own research. So we hope to see everyone again next week. And thank you once again to Dr. Friedberg. We're always so glad when you come to teach us.
It's a treat. Thanks everyone for giving part of your Monday.